My name is David Aramba. I'm an instructional designer here with the digital learning team at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. And today we're going to be talking about course and assessment design with Gen AI in mind. So in today's workshop, we will explore course design considerations, such as learning outcomes and assessments, in the context of generative AI. Ultimately, what I and the DL team hope you walk away with today is a better sense of if, when, and how to leverage GenAI for your unique pedagogical context. Here's an outline of what we can expect from today's session. I'm going to start with some eating your vegetables type stuff, going over some GenAI guardrails to keep in mind from the jump, as well as a quick review of learning outcomes for the course level. And then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of it, revisiting learning outcomes for the GenAI era, and finally making decisions about assessments. So that's going to be roughly the sequence of events today. Now, we won't be able to address everything under the sun as it pertains to GenAI and learning and teaching. So if there's anything we don't get around to today, I encourage you to take a look at our other resources linked on the slide here. Of note, I'll flag our it's the first link on the left side. Our Managing Generative AI in the Classroom Guide is our most comprehensive resource on Gen AI in teaching and learning to date. I think that'd be a good place to look. And also, we recently ran workshops on Gen AI in written assignments and building knowledge and understanding of Gen AI with students. Links to those are in the call-out box to the right. And looking ahead, we will also be offering a hands-on online workshop on Gen AI for instructors next week. That registration link is also on that slide. To start us off, here in Part A, I'll be discussing some important guardrails for Gen AI use to help you mitigate risks and promote student learning. On this slide, I've identified 4 areas of uncertainty when it comes to generative AI: explainability, replicability, stability, and detectability. And I'll go through each of these. So when I speak to explainability, I mean that Gen AI models, or rather the large language models that power Gen AI chatbots, are opaque. And in the words of critical AI researcher Johan Fredrickson, they're epistemologically indifferent. It's a mouthful. So it's hard to fully trust the output when we don't have a clear idea of the data inputs and computational processes that generated the output. Moreover, sometimes these processes are not even fully understood by the developers themselves. Secondly, replicability. By that, I mean that the same prompt may result in different outputs each time it's entered. This adds potential logistical challenges if you're planning class activities with Gen AI, so be sure to test often. Coming off the heels of that as well is stability, insofar as these tools are updated on a regular basis. It's really hard actually to keep up with all the changes that get added to these tools. So features can appear and disappear often without warning. This actually happened to us at last year's Learning and Teaching Conference during a hands-on workshop. Suddenly, the ability to upload files in the chat window was no longer available, but thankfully, the feature returned within a week. And finally, in terms of uncertainties or areas to be aware of, is detectability. So tools claiming to detect AI-generated content are not recommended at TMU by the Academic Integrity Office, as they are inconsistent at best. In one study, researchers found that even when the text was generated through the same LLM and detected through the same AI detection tool, different files showed different AI similarity scores. Something to keep in mind. From the uncertainties on the past slide emerges sites of risk, and I've identified 4 here: privacy, intellectual property, accuracy and bias, and skill atrophy. And with each of these risks, I've included some mitigation strategies. So with respect to privacy, thankfully, TMU's instance of Gemini will not use our data to train models because it was run through a vetting process. Still, though, the Privacy Office, out of abundance of caution, is still advising us to avoid inputting sensitive data such as student IDs, grades, class lists, and student work. This is still considered a level of sensitivity that we're advised not to do. So that's something for you to keep in mind for your academic assistants to keep in mind, and for your students as well. And so the link for what constitutes classified information is included on the slide there. In terms of intellectual property, dominant GenAI models were trained on mass swaths of information, much of it copyrighted. Copyright-related lawsuits against these GenAI models are ongoing. So to err on the side of caution, try whenever possible to only input works that are in the public domain or those that you hold a copyright for. When in doubt, you can review licensing details. Sometimes they might shed some light on what you can and can't do with it, or contact the holder of the intellectual property directly. Thirdly, accuracy and bias. So these models provide outputs that are based on mathematical predictions, and they're only as good as the data set that they're trained on. Therefore, we must be just as vigilant with information literacy as we are with other sources of information. In this vein, we encourage students to exercise their information literacy when using these tools, including the outputs that come from Gemini. And consider introducing students to models like the classic CRAP test, which is always fun to say, and a newer informational literacy kind of model called Accurate LE, which addresses GenAI and was developed by the University of Saskatchewan. Finally, cognitive atrophy. So recent studies have indicated that GenAI tools may have a detrimental impact on our cognitive load. So if you choose to employ Gemini in your course, be intentional with your course design and ask yourself, what distinctively human skills do I want to emphasize? This is one of the main questions that we'll be addressing in today's workshop, namely higher order cognitive tasks in your learning outcomes, designing assessments that measure process and are tied to local contexts, and foregrounding critical thinking skills. Finally, to wrap up this first section, I'm going to cover some guidelines for GenAI in your teaching. So regardless of whether you do or you don't leverage GenAI, be sure to let students know precisely what counts as a permissible use of GenAI in your course outline. Depending on your teaching style or course outcomes, you may decide there are ultimately no permissible uses. This is within your rights as an instructor, but it helps to be explicit from students about this from the start. You want to remind your academic assistants to avoid inputting that data that I described on a previous slide. Remind your students about Senate Policy 60. Note that it's been amended, I think, as of last year to address GenAI in a section that defines misrepresentation of personal identity or performance. I think that section is linked on the slide. And yeah, avoid using AI detectors if you suspect academic misconduct. There's some other things you can check for that are provided on that link there. Now, if you do permit the use of GenAI and decide to leverage it in your teaching, try to direct students to use Gemini. This will be the fairest way to ensure equal access and opportunity to each student. The Gemini that we have as staff members, that you have as faculty, and that your students have is, in terms of functionality, I think is, to my knowledge, is the same. So it's there's no special tier, like everyone's got the same access. So if for whatever reason there are more specialized tools or that you want to study in the course, and you need to choose a different tool that's not Gemini, be sure to carefully review the linked considerations for external tools. Provide students with resources on basic information and GenAI literacy. My colleague Sally has prepared something that is for both an instructor and a student audience, linked in the slide. And have your class discussions on the strengths, limitations, opportunities, and risks, and how GenAI is impacting your discipline. Okay, so now in this section, let's zoom out a little bit and focus now on what we mean by learning outcomes. This might be rudimentary for some of you. I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can, but I find that it always bears repeating because it is a really important part of the course design process. So try to think of learning outcomes as a finish line of a learning experience. That could be a lesson, an internship, or an entire academic program. Today, we'll focus on learning outcomes at the course level. They are the intended destination for students, outlining the abilities a student should have after they've cleared the hurdles of your course, such as the contents, the lectures, the activities, and the assessments. Learning outcomes answer the question, where am I going, and how will I know when I get there? So learning outcomes take a learner-centered approach, measuring what learners should be able to know, do, or feel slash value. Um, uh, and so, yeah, and those align to like what we call the three domains of learning: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. Well-written learning outcomes are of mutual benefit to both instructors and students. When thoughtfully crafted, learning outcomes can serve as both a compass for instructors and a map for students. Learning outcomes are the beginning stage of a method that is often called backwards design. Now, it's backwards because we start with that finish line in mind and then address the course components that get us there. This stands in contrast to common habits that sometimes prioritize the course content as a starting point. So using the backward design method, we instead start by, on the right-hand side of the slide, identifying desired results, then moving back to determine what acceptable evidence of those results would be in the form of assessments, both formative and summative, and finally, planning learning experiences throughout the course to prepare students for for those assessments. So the lessons enforce the assignments, and the assignments are in turn enforcing the outcomes. And here's a quick review of what a learning outcome ought to look like. Typically contains four components: the STEM, which outlines who is achieving the outcome and when; an action verb, which specifies what the student will be able to do. That the action verb will I think, come and play later in the slide deck here. Followed by a statement of what will be learned, and the context, which provides criteria or conditions as to how the outcome will be demonstrated. So on the slide here, we have an example from a music anthropology course. A potential outcome could be, by the end of this course, students will be able to synthesize ideas and concepts about music culture from across fields of study in anthropology. As you work towards creating a set of course level learning outcomes, try to aim for 5 to 10, as the conventional advice suggests somewhere in this range. Make sure that each learning outcome is specific, observable, and measurable. Here on the slide, we have something you may have seen before. We have a Bloom's taxonomy of the cognitive domain. And so there's a pyramid there. To the right of that pyramid, we see clusters of more precise verbs, such as define, discuss, and explain. Sitting to the left of that are vaguer verbs for each of those levels, like remember or understand. They tend to describe internal mental processes that are hard to demonstrate or observe. So keeping our attention on these verbs, we can see the pyramid is arranged from a lower order at the base to higher order processes at the summit. It's good to have a set of outcomes across this range in a course outline, but at the course level, you should be emphasizing higher order cognitive processes if you can. Worth mentioning that cognition isn't everything. Depending on your discipline, you might consider how course learning outcomes might also address psychomotor and affective learning domains. And there's a resource at the bottom of the slide there from the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario if you want to do more reading about that. Okay. I'm going to say that's maybe the eating our vegetables part of the presentation, and now we'll kind of get into the Gen AI heavy stuff. So as we established, course level learning outcomes should be the starting point from which you make your course design decisions. So in this section, I'm going to try to answer 3 questions related to learning outcomes in the Gen AI era. What's changed? What hasn't changed? And what can you do? Let's start with what's changed. Gen AI tools allow students to fast track many lower order cognitive tasks, e.g. remember, and jump straight into higher order tasks like create. Now, looking at this from an affordance perspective, this could be beneficial in helping to alleviate information paralysis and cognitive overload. It can also be detrimental if it's used in a way that circumvents human encoding processes that are needed for successful retrieval of information later on. And this could have big implications in real-world occupations where access to tech is not readily available. However, with intentionally designed activities and assessments, you could invite students to ask Gen AI to take on a tutor role. In this use case, Gen AI, a tool like Gemini, could help with personalized practice and reinforcement of lower order cognitive skills to help make the content stick. And speaking of Gemini, there is a somewhat new mode, I think it was rolled out in the fall, called guided learning. And this is tailored specifically to a tutor-like dialogue, whereas the default modes tend to just be focused on providing the user exactly what they want when they want it. If you or your students turn on the guided learning mode, it will take that more sort of like back and forth approach and Socratic, if you will. And to see more of that, I encourage you to register for my colleague Jason's upcoming workshop next week, which will be a more hands-on workshop than this one. Um, Now, Gen AI is not limited, of course, just to lower order cognitive skills. I think if it were limited to just those, I don't think we'd be talking about it as much in our society as we do today. Gen AI tools are also adept at performing some higher order cognitive tasks, such as analysis. So again, from an affordance perspective, um, you know, student prompts can be used by Gen AI tools to compare and contrast data, infer trends and themes, and make predictions. However, Gen AI is not infallible. It has well-documented issues with bias and fabrications. And in my experience, it still struggles a lot at producing accurate and relevant citations. So while it may seem helpful to get Gen AI to write a paper or a report, students and other knowledge workers outside of the academy will then have to spend time and energy in verifying the accuracy of the outputs that they put into tools like Gemini. And broadly, over-reliance on Gen AI for higher order tasks could weaken metacognitive and critical thinking skills. There's some early research that's suggesting that may be the case. However, with appropriate instructor guidance, students could take this a step further up the pyramid to interpret, interrogate, and ultimately evaluate the analytical work that the tool performed. In this use case, Gen AI could set the stage for students to engage in metacognitive reflection, that is, thinking about thinking. They can holistically judge the output and improve upon it, either alone or in collaboration with classmates. When we consider useful and pedagogically justified opportunities to learn with Gen AI, it's worth asking, which AI capabilities and distinctive human skills do you wish to emphasize? This useful table on the slide, provided by Oregon State University eCampus, compares human skills and ways that Gen AI can supplement human learning across the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy for the cognitive domain. I'll highlight 3 of the 6 levels. So at the bottom in purple, at the remember level, Gen AI can retrieve factual information, define terms, construct a basic timeline, but only a human can perform these tasks in situations where tech isn't readily accessible. In dark green at the apply level, Gen AI can make use of existing models, processes, or methods to solve a quantitative or qualitative inquiry. But humans get to test these models in the real world and can apply their creativity and imagination to develop novel ideas and solutions that might not have been anticipated by existing models. And at the evaluate level in yellow, Gen AI can identify pros and cons of various courses of action, but humans are best equipped to holistically appraise such actions within an ethical, historical, emotional, or disciplinary context. On this slide, the University of Toronto Centre for Teaching Support and Innovation provides examples of how learning outcomes could be modified to reflect the distinctions between human and Gen AI capabilities. Notice here on the table how the outcomes in the after column are more descriptive and end with conditions that more precisely articulate the context in which students will be expected to demonstrate their learning. None of these revised outcomes prescribe or forbid the use of Gen AI, but instead guide students towards outcomes that are generally higher order and tied more to authentic real-world problems. Let's look at the example provided by the medicine domain, which I believe is the middle row. A pre-Gen AI outcome might have asked students to compare and contrast how promotional health resources effectively and accurately present information to patient care. But when we consider human skills in relation to Gen AI affordances, we might instead ask students to assess the accuracy, reliability, and relevance of these resources, identifying biases and areas for improvement in patient care. So we've discussed how Gen AI might change your approach to learning outcomes, but what remains the same? What hasn't changed? So a couple years ago, TMU's principles and guidelines on generative artificial intelligence and learning and teaching were announced. They're housed on our website. And according to these sets of principles and guidelines, you don't need to permit or promote use of GenAI if you don't feel it's pedagogically appropriate to do so. Students are still bound by academic integrity responsibilities as outlined in Senate Policy 60 and should refer to your course outline for any guidance on if and how they may use GenAI tools. This does not, however, beg for a return or even a continued strict adherence to traditional forms of assessment either. For instance, a 2024 scoping review on high-stakes final examinations found that such assessments are poorly justified by the balance of empirical evidence. Regardless of what forms of assessment you use, students will be more motivated to complete them when they know why it's important and relevant to their learning. And if your course level learning outcomes are aligned with your assignments, you could make a stronger case to your students to do the work themselves, if you're making those connections between the assignment and the outcomes of the course. Also, humans are, by my measure, still best positioned to make insights and connections in local contexts, such as your classroom or in the community, with each other, and make insights and connections that engage emotional, interpersonal, or ethical considerations. So these are all kind of things to bear in mind as things that have not fundamentally changed in the last, I guess, 3 or 4 years. So what can you do with your course level learning outcomes to address the moment? One, you can review your existing course level learning outcomes in light of the situational factors that GenAI presents, asking yourself, which distinctly human skills do I want to foreground? What new digital literacy skills will students need to use GenAI mindfully in both academic and professional settings? And can GenAI be leveraged to practice or enhance certain cognitive skills, or might they undermine said skills? And once you've kind of done that reflection, you can add, remove, or revise the outcomes as needed. And when you do, if you're phrasing or rephrasing your outcomes, you can try to provide conditions that promote creativity, metacognitive reflection, real-world application, and collaboration with others. Now that we've examined course learning outcomes in light of GenAI, we can begin to pivot to our assessment design, as this is where students will ultimately demonstrate these outcomes. In this section, we'll provide some guiding questions and decision-making models that you can use when considering if, when, and how students can leverage GenAI in the course assessments. On this slide, we have a list of guiding questions for your existing assessments. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of each assessment? Are there any common patterns across my assessments or your assessments? Is anything missing in relation to the course learning outcomes? Maybe if it's a course you've taught a few times, maybe there's been some recurring pain points with students even prior to GenAI. This might be a good time to to think about those sort of more recurring issues that you've experienced. How can I mitigate GenAI concerns related to academic integrity and rigor? And are there pedagogically sound ways to integrate GenAI into the assessments? And so when I say mitigate, I'm gesturing towards strategies that align with the approach that's a bit resistant to GenAI or trying to protect certain skills or competencies from the affordances of GenAI. And integration I use to describe strategies that are trying to mindfully leverage GenAI for some other aim. And that language of mitigation and integration may come up throughout the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to present a few models or decision trees that can help guide your decision-making process when you're thinking about how to design or redesign your assignments. In this first example from Temple University, it's a decision tree and it's asked, should I allow my students to use generative AI tools? So in this example, the leading question is asking instructors to gain a familiarity with the types of tools that might be useful for students' assignments or in the field. So that's sort of like a first step. And then if you, I'll just go to the second person. Yeah. If you determine as an instructor that GenAI could support your course learning outcomes, um, this model then prompts you on how to communicate expectations about what is legitimate and how to model appropriate use. So demonstrating kind of like how one might use this tool, and that's something you could demonstrate during class. Um, I would even wonder if even getting in contact with your subject matter librarian at the library, um, they might have some insight on, particularly with like research heavy assignments, they might have some insight on ways in which generative AI tools, Gemini or otherwise, are being used in sort of for these sorts of research type of projects. Um, Conversely, though, if you determine that GenAI would not support your course learning outcomes, it then suggests you find ways to reduce temptation for students to take shortcuts. And some of that will come down to some assessment design strategies and sort of evergreen best practices that I hope to get to in due time. In this second decision tree model, this is from Oregon State University eCampus. This functions a little bit more like a checklist. Its decision points are addressing a multitude of factors to consider, including existing institutional and departmental policies. So in the TMU context, those would be our principles and guidelines, policy 6D, any peculiarities that exist at your departmental level. The pedagogical purpose, which is basically what we've been talking about in this presentation. Uh, Things like bias, accuracy, quality, and accountability, all speaking to some of the things that we brought up in section A of this presentation with respect to the uncertainties and the sites of risk that come from using GenAI tools. Affordability, equity, and accessibility, um, which I don't think we've unfortunately, I have not really put a whole lot of emphasis on this, but at least on the affordability side of things, that's why we do suggest uh, we suggest directing students to use Gemini at TMU because that will be an even playing field for all users. Privacy, security, and copyright. I think I spoke to some of those things in the first section. Critical thinking, which I think has come up as well. Transparency. So it's sort of like informed consent of all people that are using this particular tool. So if you've designed an assignment that heavily uses GenAI, be mindful that some students might have ethical or political resistance to using said tools. So if it's not an institutionally supported tool, especially if it's not an institutionally supported tool, try to offer alternative forms of assignments that don't require the use of GenAI if you're taking a more GenAI integrating approach. And finally, human connection. Does the use of AI significantly reduce human connection in a course or a project? And if you sense that it does, can said assignment be maybe broken down into smaller components where there is a degree of peer interaction, perhaps a peer review stage, and as part of a larger scaffolded assignment could be one way to bring that human touch back into the assessment process. So this decision tree kind of is, like I said, it feels like a bit of a checklist, but it does cover a lot of ground. And the last decision tree of sorts that I'll share is the AI assessment scale. So developed by, I think, at least 3 scholars across UK, Australia, and Vietnam. As of last year, it had been translated into nearly 30 different languages. So you may have seen something like this before. This framework runs along a continuum from no AI at the top, which would imply kind of a strict mitigation approach, to AI exploration, where integration is very much the point. And in fact, integration with GenAI and a back and forth between the learner and the instructor is also part of it. So each level here, I won't necessarily read all the text on here. It's rather text heavy, but each level contains a description of what the level is getting at, and suggested messaging to students on how you might communicate once you've decided, yeah, I think this level makes sense for this assignment, or this level makes sense for like how I envision Gen AI being used in the course. The following column gives an opportunity, gives you suggested language for you to communicate those expectations to students. And hearkening back to when I said what's changed, what hasn't changed, there are some things that broadly haven't changed with respect to assessment design strategies that are somewhat evergreen in my view. And they are just as, if not more, relevant in an AI in a Gen AI age. So there's assess process as well as product. Um, this can speak to a number of things. The most common strategy that we talk about when we're talking about process is um, giving, rather than having a summative assignment be weighted very heavily at the end of the course, maybe breaking down that summative assignment into smaller chunks. And to the extent that you and your teaching team can provide feedback in a timely manner to students, you might take, say, a major end of term paper and have a small proposal, a small annotated bibliography, maybe even a peer review of a first draft through a tool like Peer Scholar, for instance. Um, by putting less, I guess, emphasis on the product, it does hopefully encourage students to kind of plan ahead a little bit more, and value the iterative nature of learning, rather than just focusing on the deliverable. Design assessments that are authentic. So I think if you're taking a Gen AI integrative approach, if you're curious about integration, this would sort of beg the question, well, given the discipline that I'm teaching in, what, how how are students expected to use certain Gen AI tools in this particular discipline? And if there's an opportunity to engage and engage people in industry who can speak to that kind of can speak to that on the ground level, um, that might give you some ideas as to not just not just I guess like pedagogically safe ways to use Gen AI with respect to academic integrity, but maybe even ways that are actually doing the students a service by giving them a sense of how these sorts of tools are going to be used potentially in their uh, professional lives after graduation. Include opportunities for collaboration. So I think I've spoken to this a little bit as well, the notion of um, trying to embed activities throughout your course that give students an opportunity to practice skills they'll need for their assignment. And if some of these activities can be collaborative, involve conversing with each other, uh, I think that'll help to also break the sort of the hold of the almighty AI tools. Uh, and this could be done informally during class. It can also be done formally through, again, a tool like Peer Scholar. Weighting rubrics to emphasize higher order tasks. Our colleague M did a presentation on Gen AI in written assignments specifically, and this was a big chunk of their presentation. It's in essence, um, you know, sometimes rubrics might unduly place emphasis on criteria that are maybe easy for a Gen AI tool to mimic, like grammar and syntax, for instance. We do want learners to be able to produce nice outputs, but these are things that students can very easily mask through the use of GenAI tools. Um, but um, but when I think of another part of the style of academic writing, like the importance of citations, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, I'm still rather unsatisfied with the way that GenAI chatbots do citations. That might change, but you might consider asking students to provide direct hyperlinks to specific articles that they are citing in their final assignment. Uh, so it becomes easier for you or your academic assistants to check the veracity of the things that are showing up in the work cited. Um, or to have a small component of an assignment just speak to their process in terms of gathering resources and um, choosing which sources that they're citing. You could adjust the rubric to place more emphasis on some of that more metacognitive or process-oriented stuff. And I think I'm kind of speaking to that with the fifth point there, reinforcing the importance of good citation practice. I've seen some recommendations from the Academic Integrity Office. Some of, uh, in some cases, they've recommended, you know, if students can share annotated versions of, annotated highlights of things that they were ultimately reading and ultimately using towards their final assignment. Um, and kind of including that as an appendix of sorts. I've seen that as a recommendation. Um, there's also tools like there's also social annotation tools like Hypothesis, which also would help make some of that internal processes made that those process-oriented things made visible. Um, so yeah, there are both low-tech and high-tech ways uh, to shift the focus of what you're assessing students on, um, that will hopefully mitigate some of the academic integrity concerns with GenAI, and when thoughtfully done, leverage GenAI for strategically advantageous things. Also on the slide here, ran out of time to go into this in greater detail, but I've included a link to a document from the Academic Integrity Office, Assessment Strategies for Academic Integrity in the Age of Generative AI. It's a breezy 2 or 3 page document that has like a list of various strategies that you might find helpful, and some examples of GenAI integrated or mitigated assessments at other institutions, such as U of T, McMaster, UBC, and University of Virginia. And with that, I think I will bring the fire hose content part of the workshop to a close, and just quickly plug some things that we have. So we have if you do want to request a consult with somebody on our team, or request a session for your department where maybe you can see some of those more discipline-specific examples, you can email askcelt@torontomu.ca. And yeah, I guess I failed to update this slide, but yes, there's a recording from the GenAI and written assignments workshop that was done a couple weeks ago. There'll be an encore of that if I'm not mistaken in February. Stay tuned for that. My colleague Sally, who's in the room with us, did a presentation last week on how you can have conversations with students about GenAI and promote both literacy, but also like a shared understanding of where GenAI sits in the context of your pedagogical context. And next week, my colleague Jason will be hosting a more hands-on workshop, and the link there should go to the registration form. Finally, there is a QR code on the slide with a link to a feedback form, which you don't have to do right now, but we'll try to get we'll try to do a follow-up email that will link to that survey as well. But just thought we'd throw that up there in case you're having to run.